The town of Black Hollow had many stories, tales whispered in dimly lit parlors, secrets traded like currency over steaming cups of tea. But none were spoken of with as much reverence, as much fear, as the tale of the Silent Parishioner. The church of St. Muir had stood at the edge of town for nearly 2 centuries. Its towering steeple, blackened by time, cut a jagged silhouette against the sky, and its great wooden doors creaked like an old man's bones. It was a place of solace for some, a relic for others, but for the people of Black Hollow, it was also home to something inexplicable. For as long as anyone could remember, there had always been a figure sitting in the third pew from the front, left side. No one could recall the person's face, nor had anyone ever seen them enter or leave. They sat with their hands folded neatly in their lap, heads slightly bowed, as though listening intently to a sermon long since finished. No matter the time of day, no matter if the church was empty or filled with murmured prayers, the figure was there. Always there. At first, new visitors would assume they were just another parishioner deep in thought. But those who dared to sit near them spoke of an unsettling stillness. No movement, no breath, not even the subtle rise and fall of a chest. And if anyone dared to touch them, an icy dread would slither into their bones, making their fingers numb for hours afterward. It was this mystery that brought Thomas Greaves to Black Hollow. A journalist with a penchant for the bizarre, Thomas had spent the last decade chasing stories of the unexplained. Ghosts, curses, folklore. He had built a career out of skepticism, revealing the rational truth behind the supernatural. And yet, when he first heard of the Silent Parishioner, something in the tale sent a chill through him. The moment he stepped inside St. Muir, he understood why. The church smelled of dust and candle wax, the air thick with the weight of old prayers. Flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the stone floor, and despite the warmth of the summer evening outside, the interior was cold. Unnaturally cold. Then he saw it. The figure sat precisely where the stories had claimed, third pew, left side. A dim light from the stained glass above cast muted colors onto their still form. They wore dark clothing, their hands resting in their lap, fingers slightly curled. Their head was bowed, their face obscured by shadows. Thomas swallowed hard. It was one thing to hear a story, it was another to see it with his own eyes. Slowly, he approached, the old wooden floor groaning under his weight. "Excuse me," he said softly. No response. Closer now, just a few feet away. He could see the way their clothes hung stiffly, as if untouched by time. "Hello." The silence pressed against his ears, thick and suffocating. Thomas hesitated, then reached out a hand, just enough to graze the figure's shoulder. The moment his fingers made contact, a jolt of ice shot through him, a sensation so intense that he staggered backward. His breath hitched, his vision blurred for a moment. The cold seeped into his bones, clawing its way up his arm like frost creeping over glass. And then, for the first time in anyone's memory, the Silent Parishioner moved. They lifted their head, just slightly, and though their face remained hidden in shadow, Thomas felt something watching him. Not with eyes, but with an awareness so profound it made his skin prickle. Then, a whisper. Soft, distant, as if carried by the wind itself. "Why have you come?" Thomas stumbled back, his pulse hammering in his throat. He had come for a story. But now, he wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. The air inside St. Muir thickened, pressing down on Thomas Greaves like a great, unseen weight. His breath came shallow, uneven. The whisper still echoed in his mind. "Why have you come?" A question not spoken with lips but carried on something older, something colder than mere voice. His instinct told him to run, to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever had just stirred in the pew. But his journalistic curiosity held him frozen in place, his fingers gripping the edge of the pew before him. The figure remained still now, their head tilted slightly as if waiting for an answer. Thomas swallowed the lump rising in his throat. I'm here to learn the truth," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then, the candles flickered violently, though no wind had passed through the church. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and contorting like silent spectators. The figure in the pew did not move again. Thomas forced himself to exhale, to release the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hand still tingled where he had touched the figure's shoulder, a numb coldness lingering beneath his skin. He flexed his fingers, willing the sensation away. Had it been real? Or was his mind playing tricks on him, warping fear into something tangible? He needed answers. Gathering his courage, he moved down the aisle, careful to keep his distance from the figure. He reached the altar, glancing up at the towering crucifix that loomed over the church. Dust motes swirled in the dim candlelight. There had to be records, old ledgers, notes, anything that might explain this phenomenon. If this figure had been here for as long as the townsfolk claimed, surely someone had documented it. Turning on his heel, he made for the small door near the pulpit, the one he had seen the priest disappear into earlier that day. If the church held any secrets, they would be buried in its archives. The wooden door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a narrow hallway lined with old portraits. The faces in the paintings were worn with time, their eyes dark hollows gazing out at nothing. The hallway smelled of aged paper and something else, something faintly metallic. Blood. Thomas shook off the thought and stepped inside. A single bulb buzzed above, casting a dim yellow glow. At the end of the hall stood another door, slightly ajar. He pushed it open and found himself in what appeared to be a study. A heavy wooden desk dominated the room, its surface cluttered with books, loose papers, and an old oil lamp. Shelves lined the walls, filled with tomes so ancient their spines had begun to crumble. He ran his fingers over the books, searching for anything that might give him insight. Then, his eyes landed on a small, leather-bound journal tucked beneath a stack of documents. He pulled it free, brushing dust from the cover. The spine cracked as he opened it. The first page bore a name, written in ink that had long since begun to fade. Father Elias Grayson, the last known priest of St. Muir. Thomas skimmed through the pages, his pulse quickening as he read. The figure has not moved in over a century. No one claims to have seen it arrive. No one knows who they are. Attempts to remove them have all failed. Hands grow numb, voices falter, courage crumbles. It is not a person. It is something else. And it is waiting. Thomas's breath hitched. He turned the page. More writing, hurried and frantic. The ink smudged as though written by an unsteady hand. I fear I have spoken too much. It listens. It knows when it is being watched. And sometimes, late at night, I swear, I hear it whispering my name. A slow creak sounded from the hallway. Thomas's blood ran cold. He wasn't alone. Thomas Greaves went still, his fingers gripping the edge of the journal as if holding on to something solid could anchor him in reality. The creak in the hallway had been unmistakable. Someone, or something, was there. The dim bulb above him flickered, casting shifting shadows along the walls. His heart pounded against his ribs, every instinct screaming at him to stay quiet. He strained his ears, listening. Silence. And then, a whisper. Soft, distant, curling through the air like breath against the back of his neck. Thomas. His name. The journal nearly slipped from his grasp. Cold dread slithered through his veins. He turned his head toward the open doorway, pulse hammering so hard he swore the walls could hear it. The hallway beyond was empty. Or so it seemed. The paintings still lined the walls, their faded faces staring out in eerie silence. The light bulb buzzed faintly overhead. The air was thick, too thick, as if the very walls were holding their breath. He took a slow step forward. His boots scraped against the wooden floor, the sound deafening in the suffocating quiet. Another step. He reached the doorway, pressing his palm against the frame as he peered into the dim hall. Nothing. But the whisper had been real. He knew the mind could play tricks in moments of fear, but there was something about this, something unnatural. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't his imagination twisting sounds into meaning. Something had whispered his name. Thomas exhaled shakily and turned back into the study. He had to focus. The journal in his hands was proof that others had experienced this presence before him. He flipped further into the book, scanning the frantic, desperate entries. It watches. It knows. The moment you acknowledge it, you are never truly alone again. His throat tightened. Do not turn your back to it. A chill ran down his spine. He glanced over his shoulder, just to be sure. The hallway remained empty. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of unseen eyes pressing against him, crawling over his skin like spider legs. Flipping further through the journal, his fingers stopped on an entry that had been underlined multiple times. The Silent Parishioner is not bound to the church. It is bound to knowledge. Those who learn of it, who seek to understand it, invite it closer. It moves for them. A slow, creeping horror unfurled in Thomas's stomach. He had come here to uncover the truth. Had he unknowingly invited it in? A sudden crash shattered the silence. Thomas spun toward the noise, heart slamming against his ribs. The oil lamp on the desk had toppled over, rolling to the floor with a dull clang. But he hadn't touched it. The room felt colder now, the candlelight beyond the door dimming as if something unseen had leached the warmth from the air. And then, just beyond the doorway, in the very spot where the hallway should have been empty, a shadow stood. Not a trick of the light. Not his own. A figure. Still. Silent. Watching. The breath caught in Thomas's throat. He knew, without a doubt, that he had not been alone for some time now. And the silent parishioner had finally risen from its seat. The shadow in the doorway did not move. Thomas felt his body tense, every muscle locked in place as if the air itself had thickened around him, holding him still. The figure was nothing more than an outline, a void where a person should be. No details, no features, just an absence. But he could feel it watching him. His breath came shallow, his mind racing through the options. Run. Speak. Close your eyes and pray. No. He forced himself to stay calm, gripping the journal so tightly the leather bit into his palms. Who are you? His voice barely carried past his lips. Silence. The shadow remained, unmoving, blocking his only exit. Thomas's fingers itched to grab the oil lamp, to hurl it at the thing, but something inside him warned against aggression. He had seen enough in his years of investigating to know that some things you did not provoke. Instead, he took a slow step backward, keeping his eyes locked on the figure. The moment his foot touched the wooden floor behind him, the figure moved. Not forward. Not sideways. It shifted. Like smoke curling into a new shape, its edges blurred, stretched, twisted. And then, a whisper, low, crawling through the room like a breath through ancient stone. You should not have come. The voice was wrong. Not deep, not high, not even entirely human. It felt layered, as though many voices spoke at once, overlapping in an eerie, discordant melody. Thomas's skin erupted in goosebumps. His mind screamed at him to flee, but his body remained frozen. The shadow shifted again. Closer. And this time, he could almost see a hint of something within it. Not a face, something worse. Something hollow. Thomas inhaled sharply. If he stayed here any longer, he wasn't sure he'd ever leave at all. He took another step back. And another. The figure did not follow, but he could feel it pressing against the air, reaching for him without moving. Finally, his fingers found what he was looking for, the edge of the window behind the desk. He didn't hesitate. With one sharp motion, he threw his elbow back, shattering the glass. Cold night air rushed in, the scent of damp earth flooding his senses. Without thinking, he turned and leapt. Glass tore at his sleeves as he tumbled through, landing hard on the grass outside. For a moment, the world spun. The cold bit into his skin, grounding him back to reality. And then, silence. He forced himself to his feet, staggering slightly as he turned back toward the church. The broken window gaped like an open wound, jagged edges glinting in the dim moonlight. The study inside was dark now. Empty. The shadow was gone. But the feeling, that terrible, suffocating presence, was still there, pressing against the air like an unspoken warning. Thomas clutched the journal against his chest. He had come to St. Muir for answers. And now, something knew his name. Something that would not forget him. The cold night air wrapped around Thomas like a damp shroud, but the chill that crawled through his bones had nothing to do with the wind. He stood in the overgrown grass outside St. Muir, his breath coming in quick, uneven bursts. The broken window gaped above him, jagged shards of glass catching the moonlight like a row of hungry teeth. Inside, the shadow had vanished, but the weight of its presence lingered, thick and unseen, as if it had seeped into the very walls of the church. Thomas pressed the journal against his chest, fingers tightening around the cracked leather cover. He had read about haunted places before, places where people vanished, where unseen forces made themselves known through whispers and flickering lights. But this this was different. This was aware. His heartbeat slowed, settling into a steady rhythm as he forced himself to think. Running blindly into the night wouldn't solve anything. He needed to understand what had just happened, what was still happening. A rustling sound cut through the silence. Thomas stiffened. The wind stirred the tall grass around him, whispering against his boots, but this sound had come from somewhere else. Somewhere nearby. Slowly, he turned his head toward the churchyard. The old gravestones stood like crooked teeth in the moonlight, some leaning, others crumbling with time. But beyond them, at the very edge of the cemetery where the grass turned to shadow, a figure stood. Not the one from inside. This one was human. Thomas exhaled slowly. The man wore a long coat, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. He was watching, standing far enough away to seem passive, but close enough to let Thomas know he was there. A local. Someone from the church. Thomas cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. A slow prickle of unease crawled down Thomas's spine. His fingers twitched against the journal. Then, the man lifted a hand and pointed. Not at the church. At Thomas. A cold wave of nausea rolled through him. The simple gesture carried a strange, unspoken finality, as if a verdict had just been passed. Then, just as silently as he had appeared, the man turned and walked into the darkness, his form swallowed by the mist curling along the edge of the trees. Thomas wanted to call after him, to demand an explanation, but his voice caught in his throat. Because as he stood there, gripping the old journal with shaking hands, a thought rose unbidden in his mind. That man hadn't been pointing at him. He had been pointing at something behind him. Thomas spun, his breath lodged in his chest. But there was nothing there. Just the broken window. Just the church, looming in the dark. Just the silent, unseen presence that he knew, deep in his bones, was still watching. Still waiting. Thomas Greaves stood frozen in the churchyard, the damp grass beneath his boots whispering as the night wind stirred. His pulse drummed in his ears, loud and insistent, but it was not the wind, nor the cold, nor even the silent church behind him that kept him rooted in place. It was the man, the stranger who had stood at the edge of the graveyard. The man who had pointed. Not at Thomas. At something behind him. Even now, Thomas could feel the weight of unseen eyes, something just out of reach, just beyond his understanding. Slowly, cautiously, he turned back towards St. Muir. The church stood silent and solemn, its windows dark, its steeple cutting into the night sky like the spine of some great, slumbering beast. The broken window he had escaped from gaped in the moonlight, glass shards glittering like frozen tears. Nothing moved. No shadow loomed in the doorway. No whisper crawled from the darkness. But Thomas knew better than to trust his eyes. He swallowed hard, forcing air into his lungs. He needed to think. He needed to act. The journal in his hands felt heavier now, as though the words inside it carried a weight greater than mere ink. Father Elias Grayson had written of the silent parishioner, of the thing that had always sat in the pew, unmoving, unblinking. But in the priest's later entries, his writing had changed, turning desperate, erratic. It listens. It watches. It does not move unless it is noticed. A fresh wave of unease washed over Thomas. He had noticed it. And now, it had noticed him back. The stranger in the graveyard. Had he been a warning? A witness? Or had he been something else entirely? Thomas cast one last glance toward the misty tree line where the man had disappeared, then turned on his heel and strode toward the road. His car was parked nearly a mile away, down the narrow dirt path that led into town. With each step, the presence of St. Muir grew lighter, as though the unseen weight pressing against his chest was easing its grip. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to look over his shoulder. A superstitious part of him whispered that if he turned around now, he'd see something standing too close. Following. The thought sent a shudder through him, but he didn't quicken his pace. Fear bred mistakes. Panic made people trip, made them look when they shouldn't. Steady. Breathe. Walk. The road stretched ahead, barely illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the trees. The town of Black Hollow was distant, its street lamps glowing faintly in the valley below. A promise of normalcy, of people, of light. Then, a sound. Faint, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Not his. They came from behind him. Slow. Deliberate. The crisp crunch of gravel beneath unseen feet. Thomas clenched his jaw, every muscle in his body tensing. It was following him. He inhaled through his nose, forcing himself not to react. If this thing moved when it was acknowledged, then maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't act if he ignored it. The footsteps did not stop. Closer. Thomas's pulse thundered. The town wasn't far now. A few hundred more yards. Just keep walking. Crunch. 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 A whisper slithered through the darkness behind him. Soft, like the wind through hollow bones. You see now. Thomas clenched his fists. The voice was not close, not yet, but it was near enough that he could hear the edges of it, like a breath just beyond his ear. He kept walking. The footsteps followed. The road sloped downward. The first flickering street lamp stood ahead. Almost there. Then. The footsteps stopped. The air behind him felt empty. Lighter, somehow. A trap? A trick? Slowly, carefully, Thomas let himself breathe again. His fingers ached from clenching the journal so tightly. He took one final step onto the paved edge of town, letting the glow of the street lamp wash over him. Then, and only then, did he turn his head. The road behind him was empty. No figure. No shadow. No footprints in the dust. Nothing. But deep inside, he knew the truth. It had followed him here. And it was waiting for him to be alone again. 3 nights after he left St. Muir, Thomas Greaves did not sleep. The whispers followed him, at first, only at the edges of his perception, like the distant hum of an unseen presence. A rustling behind closed doors. A faint breath against his ear when no one was near. But soon, it grew bolder. On the 4th night, he caught his own reflection watching him. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't exhaustion. In the mirror above his bathroom sink, his reflection stood a fraction too still, eyes slightly unfocused, lips parted as though listening to something only it could hear. The silent parishioner had come with him. And it was getting closer. Desperation took hold. He spent hours scouring Father Elias Grayson's journal, searching for anything, any way out. Buried in the final, near-illegible pages, he found the last recorded words of the priest before his disappearance. It does not want to be understood. It wants to be followed. It moves for those who seek it, and once it has moved, it cannot be undone. The only way to stop it is to return. Thomas closed the journal, his blood running cold. There was no escaping it. There was only one way to end this. St. Muir loomed ahead, untouched by time, as if waiting for him. The air around the church was wrong, thick, expectant. It felt like stepping into a room where something had just been whispering and had only fallen silent at his arrival. Thomas stepped through the doors. The candles were already lit. And the figure was back in its pew. The silent parishioner sat exactly as before, hands folded in its lap, hood casting its face in deep shadow. As if it had never moved. As if it had been waiting for him to return. Thomas's throat tightened. The only way to stop it is to return. But return for what? His gaze flickered to the pew beside the figure. Empty. The realization came slow, sinking into him like ice. It had never been waiting for him to leave. It had been waiting for him to join. His knees weakened as a terrible understanding settled in his chest. It wasn't a spirit, a demon, or some lost soul. It was a seat. A role. And once someone saw it, *** truly saw it, *** they became part of it. His breath hitched. He took a slow step back. The figure in the pew moved. It turned its head toward him, so subtly, so slightly that if he had blinked, he might have missed it. A hand lifted. It pointed to the empty space beside it. Thomas's stomach twisted. No. No. He stepped back, *** too fast, too desperate, ***, and the whisper came, soft, patient. Your seat is waiting. The air around him thickened, growing heavy, pulling him forward. The figure did not force him. It did not move toward him. It simply waited. And as Thomas Greaves stood frozen in the candlelit church, the truth wrapped around him like a vice. Every town had its ghosts. Every haunted place had its legend. But someone always had to sit in the last pew. The silent parishioner was not a curse. It was a role to be filled. And Thomas had noticed it. His breath shuddered from his lips. The candles flickered. And slowly, as if guided by something far beyond himself, he sat down. The breath left his lungs. His hands folded in his lap. His mind emptied. He did not think. He did not move. He only waited. And far away, beyond the candlelight and the crumbling walls of St. Muir, a traveler would come to the town of Black Hollow. They would hear the rumors. They would come to the church. And someday soon, when they finally saw, when they finally understood, Thomas Greaves would rise. And the next silent parishioner would take his place.